Hey guys, my name is Stephen Lowe, and I am the author of Overcoming Gravity. So today we'll be going through the fundamental knowledge base part one, and we'll be looking at the chapter four on structural balance considerations, and we'll be going over the why of structural balance, an overview of shoulder health, maintaining structural balance, and then general recommendations. So let's get started. So the why of structural balance. Generally speaking, over the course of my training and coaching career, you get a lot of weightlifters who mainly focus on the beach muscles, so your chest, your biceps, and abs. And so those people tend to have poor posture. Similarly, a lot of people are in school or they have desk jobs, and so their posture is a little bit poor. However, newer research has tended to shown that imbalances do not necessarily cause pain or injury, and so there is that fact to consider. In most cases, though, being in quote unquote poor postures definitely is a risk factor for potential injury, but we don't know who gets pain and injury just by looking at people. So, like, if somebody was in a wheelchair for most of their life and was slumped over, yeah, you don't know who specifically in those wheelchair instances are going to get, say, back or neck pain. You just don't know. So you can't say somebody is going to get pain based on their posture or if they're just working out beach muscles. Some people just never get pain. But it is the case that it is a greater risk factor. So that needs to be considered. So for my own story, when I was just starting to train for a few years. Basically, I was doing an overabundance of pushing, so dips, planche work, handstand push-ups, and then I was virtually doing no pulling at all with just pull-ups. And so I started to develop shoulder pain myself in the front of the shoulder. And so I wanted to figure that out. And so I was reading up online and got to places about imbalances, even though it's a little bit inaccurate now, it did happen to me. So my risk was high enough that I did get shoulder pain from doing too much pushing and not enough pulling. And so that contributed to my shoulder pain. And then I started out in more pulls, did some rotator cuff work, and my pain went away. So very simple in my case, can be less simple in other cases, but for the most part, balancing, pushing, and pulling does help a lot of people to eliminate potential risk for shoulder issues. So, additionally, in my coaching and training, I've seen that most people tend to progress the best when they have a balanced push and pull. And maybe that is because the fact that when you're doing push exercises and is working, say, the front of the shoulder, the back of the shoulder is used as a stabilizer. Maybe that does have a role to play in the fact that you can move higher loads when everything is more stable. But it could be something else. We don't know, but generally speaking, the balanced method of training does seem to help in progression and decreasing risk of potential injuries. Likewise, athletes do have a wide variety of imbalances, and so, for example, baseball pitchers, since they're throwing, 100 miles per hour with just one limb all the time, say their right arm for baseball pitchers, there's going to be imbalances throughout their body, just because they're landing on one leg all the time with most of their weight. They're winding up through one arm. And so there are a lot of imbalances, but we know that not all of them get pain or potential injuries. And likewise with different sports like climbing and rowing, which are more pull dominated, or more pushing dominated sports like your powerlifters who mainly do like bench press and overhead press as their main push movements. We don't know who gets injured in those specific circumstances, but we do know it is a potential risk factor. So you don't necessarily also need to bring up the imbalances to where they're even. So, like many climbers who get very strong and can climb at a high level can do one arm chin ups, but if you take them and they have never even trained in the gym before doing pushing movements, they might not even be able to do a single dip or maybe only a few bad form push ups. This imbalance may not necessarily cause an injury, although it can present a risk. But you do not necessarily need to get their dips, for example, up to them body weight dipping their own weight. So if they're 150 pounds, strapping another 150 pounds to them and doing dips, you don't necessarily need to get them up that high to reduce injury risk. You just need to get them training at some in most cases and bringing it up so that there's less of a potential imbalance there to reduce risk of injuries. So, a general overview of shoulder health. The shoulder in general has the greatest capacity for movement of any joint in the body. It can go fully overhead and then back for a great distance into hyperextension, and then obviously out to the side and back down. And it also has a very good capacity for rotation as well. And so, as you can see in the bottom left corner, a picture of the skeletal humerus, the upper arm bone, and the scapula. You can see that the joint face is actually very small, and the labrum around it helps the ball to sit in the socket. And obviously, since the joint contact space is very small, although there is a great capacity for range of motion, there also is a great capacity for instability as well. And so, a lot of training, especially when talking about structural balance, is making sure that the shoulder is strong in all directions and that it is able to move well in all directions. And this tends to help to prevent those injuries. So I have two axioms in the book. Basically, keeping the shoulders and shoulder blades operating optimally is the key to body weight strength success. And axiom two, which is the shoulder is the linchpin of the upper body, just like the hips are for the lower body. And basically, what these axioms are driving at is if we keep our shoulders healthy, good mobility, good amount of strength and control, then they're generally going to stay healthy and injury free. So, maintaining structural balance. In the first edition of Overcoming Gravity, I basically went into a lot of different shoulder articulations, which are basically different movements of the shoulder. So, the common ones are like flexion, where you bring your arm up in front. And so, there are different types of flexion where, say, you're moving your arm fully up and overhead when doing that. But there also is flexion in uh, extension or hyperextension, where your arm is back behind your body and you're moving it forward. That is also considered flexion. And so there's also extension in flexion, which is your arm is up and you're pulling down like this. And then extension into hyperextension, whereas you're moving your arm back like that, which is used for things like VSIT and MANA, where your arms are going behind yourself. Um, Overall, for those without a good anatomy and physiology background or strength training background, this was a little too complicated, and I got a lot of basically people asking questions about that online through social media. And so, in the second edition, I basically simplified it so that we would be able to understand things a lot better, and it's pretty much just as effective. So, the two distinctions I made was with pulling exercises and pushing exercises. Pulling exercises are where the center of mass is moving towards your hands. And so, for example, with pull ups with your arms overhead, your center of mass is about where your hips are as a composite of your whole body. And so, when you're doing pull ups, the main movement is pulling down. So, your center of mass is moving towards your hands. Similarly, with pushing movements, the movement, like a push up, your center mass is moving away from your hands as you do the push up. So that's an easy way to understand pushing and pulling movements. And they generally also work the shoulder in those two different ways. So with pushing movements, as you're pushing your center mass away, you're usually moving your arm in flexion. Same with handstand push ups. You're moving your hands away from your center of mass and it's moving your arms up into flexion. And so you're working your anterior delts. Um, with pulling exercises, obviously you're pulling down, so you're moving your shoulder into relative extension. Same with rowing movements, you're moving your shoulder into relative extension, and so you're working mostly your posterior delts in those cases. So there's four distinctions that I like to make just as a gross simplification of movement, and those are vertical pushing, horizontal pushing, vertical pulling, and horizontal pulling. Now, not just in my book, but across the internet, there is some criticism of this as, a gross oversimplification. And obviously, I've noted that it is a simplification. And so, like, a lot of people prefer basic movements when starting bodyweight exercises to be a horizontal push, like your push ups or your planche progression, and the vertical pushing, which can be like something like dips where you're pushing down, or handstand push ups where you're pushing up. So, obviously, these two work way different ranges of motion of the shoulder. With dips, your arms behind your body and coming to even, whereas with handstand push-ups, it's starting from forward in your body and pushing all the way up into full flexion with your arm overhead. And so since there is a distinction between them, a lot of people like to start with horizontal pushing, like with push-ups and planche progression, and start with handstand push-ups. I tend to not like that. I tend to prefer starting with dips and push-up or planche progression, and there's a couple reasons for this. One, most people have body weight goals such as muscle up, and muscle up requires obviously a pull up, a transition phase, and a dip. And so getting strong with dips is a very good idea. Secondly, dips are similar to the squat of the lower body, so they're good for building a lot of basic strength, and especially in your chest, your anterior delts, and your triceps. And so that is very helpful in the long run. And then with most bodyweight or gymnastics or calisthenics routines, you're also doing some form of handstand work as skill work. And so you're already getting some max range overhead work with the shoulder and traps and scapula. And so you don't necessarily need an overlap with the handstand push-ups progression and doing handstands. So those are the main reasons why I like starting with dips as one of the main movements instead of handstand push-ups. Whereas if you do start with handstand push-ups, you can do that. But generally, for most people, I like transitioning dips around the level 4, 5, 6 area over to handstand push-ups if you don't have like a dip goal in the long run. So if somebody has a handstand push-ups goal, they'll eventually transfer the dips into handstand push-ups to get the more movement-specific training. But starting with the dips just to build a good foundation with the bodyweight exercises. Horizontal pushing, I basically covered before. Basically, it's horizontally pushing the hands. So, bench press also fits in this, your push ups and your planche work, where your hands are in front of you and you're working the shoulder like that. Vertical pulling, very similar to vertical pushing in that there's pull ups, but there is also inverted hang where you're hanging upside down and pulling your hands up and raising yourself up upside down. So that is an option. Generally, most people have discounted the vertical pulling inverted pull ups just because the range of motion is not as good in that specific exercise, and because one arm chains have more strength conference to most exercises, and so you don't necessarily need to train inverted pull-ups. The main exercises they would be useful for are things like the elevator, so the inverted muscle up. And so it's not really needed much in that case, and so most people just generally skip it. Horizontal pulling is your general inverted rows, your back lever, and front lever. So those are the main standout ones there. So as you can see, all these four different categories, two from pulling and two from pushing, well, three from pushing, they tend to encompass pretty much the wide variety of movements, and you can have them all together in a routine at once, especially since most routines can accommodate two, maybe three pushing and pulling elements. And so you get a wide range that helps to build that base of strength, especially in the long run. So, my general recommendations, I like to pair handstands and L-sit, V-sit mana work. But if somebody doesn't have the goal of doing L-sit, V-sit mana, I like to just have them especially work through German hanging skin cat, where you're hanging with your arms behind your body. And the reason for that is because you're working basically the shoulder through the full range of motion that is capable of. And so when you have that strength and mobility through that full range of motion, tends to keep the shoulders healthier than if you have been limiting yourself in specific ranges of motion. Likewise, with handstand work, you get that full overhead flexion, and then the mana and skin the cat, you get that full range in the reverse of the shoulder. So generally, the variety of vertical and horizontal pushing and pulling work tends to get the best strength gains from what I've seen, and it does shore up any movement weaknesses. And so, like I explained before, with the specific working through all of the different range of motion. Basically, you're getting hitting the shoulder and all the scapular muscles around it in many different ways, and so that tends to give the best strength gains over time. And so that's why I tend to like a more variety of movements instead of what some people do in the beginning is like do two variations of pull-ups and ignore rowing. So maybe they'll be doing pull-ups or chin-ups. And so maybe they'll get slightly better at chin-ups than normal, but usually with a pull-up and a row, you tend to get at least the same amount of good progress, and you're hitting your biceps, back, and your scapular muscles in a good way that often leads to faster progress in the long run than had you done just chin ups and pull ups as your two main exercises. Other exercises that can be useful for bodyweight training are straight arm press handstands, especially if you have lever aspirations. The levers themselves, um, the handstand push-ups, rope climbing, and maybe some other exercises. As I talked about in a previous Overcoming Gravity Online part, having uh, basically working through a lot of the straight arm ranges of motion, especially starting at the beginning, are going to help with strength in the long run. And you can do both bent arm and straight arm strengthening. And we'll go into that into a bit more detail in some of the subsequent videos as well. So that's all I got for you guys in this one. And be sure to tune in for the next episode.